It is good to have you back as we dive into this book study. If you were enjoying it before and then we paused for a while, you're like, come on, let's quit the vision stuff. Let's get back to Revelation. We are back there now. I also want to welcome Coastal Church. Pastor Jay asked if they could stream this service tonight with the Coastal crew. Congratulations on your baptisms. We are one church, folks. We've got us and South Church and Coastal, and we are so excited what God is doing around the three campuses. And at all three campuses, we're diving back into Revelation. So Coastal, thanks for letting me join you for a few moments this evening for you and this morning for us. If you've just showed up at our church, if you've just kind of come in the last little while, maybe Revelation's a new idea for you. Maybe you haven't been journeying with us, and maybe you've heard things about Revelation, or you have ideas or images. Maybe you were raised where you kind of were, if you're raised in church, you kind of were told to avoid that book. It's scary. It's about end times and battles and beasts and wars. You're like, I'm not really going near. It's far too confusing. If that was your story, that's my story. I'm not blaming anybody for how I was raised or the ministry that I was a part of, but for whatever reason, I was raised in a church where Revelation, by and large, was avoided. And if not avoided, definitely not leaned into or leveraged or preached from, and I'm not sure why, but we seem to be comfortable with 65 books of the Bible, but this 66th book made a lot of people nervous, and maybe that's your story. I get that. Others of you, maybe you were raised around this book, you have history, you have experience. Maybe it's your favorite book. Like, man, tell the end story. Remind people that we win. Remind people that this happens, that God is good. And maybe you even took that love so far that you kind of obsessed over the book. Maybe you are a self-proclaimed expert. You've read all the books. You've got all the images figured out. You know what the mark of the beast means. You know who the beast is. You know what Armageddon is going to be. And you don't want to brag, but you even know when Jesus is coming back. Can I just say, wherever you land on the spectrum, whether you are intimidated and maybe afraid of the book, and maybe you've kind of obsessed and become a bit of an expert of the book, can I just get you to meet me in the middle? Can I just get you to be a student of the book? You don't have to be afraid, and you don't have to try to be an expert. There is stuff that you will never understand, so let go of the expert title. And there are lots of things you absolutely can understand and are actually words of hope and encouragement, and you don't need to be afraid of it. And so we've been walking through this book. We're about to crack open chapter 4, as you just heard Courtney read, or whoever read it at Coastal tonight. If you've missed it and you want to play catch-up, you can go online onto YouTube or Facebook, and there's a library of content. You can listen to me for hours talk about Revelation. You lay down at night, put your earbuds in, and I will just talk you to sleep at night like I do here at 11. So we've got lots of content for you. But as we journey, this would be a book where you could get caught up in a lot of the details and miss the overall story. This is absolutely a kind of book where you could go down little bunny trails and rabbit holes, and you could kind of be spiraling off and then lose the point of the entire book. And so I gave us a bit of a guiding word as we've been going through this series. And so this may look familiar to you. Revelation is a call for Jesus' people to faithfully follow in the face of trials and oppositions in that time, this time, and the time to come. Does that look familiar? Does it look familiar? Come on now, preach with me. We've been looking at this a lot, so I hope it's familiar, or at least, yes, I vaguely remember that. The point of that guiding phrase is to remind us that this prophetic, apocalyptic letter, and it's threefold, has guided the church in the past, will guide the church in the present, and will guide the church in the future, however long we have. This book is prophetic. There is an idea where you're meant to read it and realize not everything is as it seems in the world. Revelation is an apocalypse, an unveiling, a pulling back the curtain. But there's also this apocalyptic idea of the things that are to come. Yes, there's a present tone and a bit of a future tone, and it's wrapped in a letter. John is a real guy on a real island called Patmos where he has been exiled there, and he is actually sending this out to the church in the area then, now, and in the days to come. I found another quote this week that I thought was really helpful for how we navigate the book of Revelation. In the Bible, prophetic literature calls for the people of God to walk in holiness and endurance, to reject the evil and rebellion of their day. One of the primary things Revelation wants to do for you is to call you to holiness and endurance despite the pull of a predominant culture that is rejecting and even mocking Jesus' reign and rule. Isn't that good? Man, that last part, let me just read it one more time. One of the primary things that Revelation wants to do is to call you and me to walk in holiness. That's how we live. There is a manner we are to walk that Jesus calls us to. And with endurance, how long we make that walk, despite the pull of a predominant culture that is rejecting and even mocking Jesus' reign and rule. My goodness, that's good. Now, I don't know how long some of you have been walking with Jesus, but if you've been walking with Jesus for a few decades, living in Canada, I will just say to you, and you will know this to be true, it has become increasingly difficult to live out a Christian faith in Canada. I'm not here to rail against Canada. I'm not here to rail against our leaders. I'm not here to do any of that stuff. But if you've been paying attention from the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 10s, and the 20s, there has been an upward climb of difficulty for Christians to live out their faith in practical ways in our country. This is not new information, is it? It's challenging. It feels like some days you are walking in a stream and the stream is flowing against you and you can feel the current pushing you, and if you turned and walked the other way, it would be easier. You've walked on the beach before just deep enough that when the tide is going out, you can almost feel the pull on your legs and ankles, can you not? That's kind of how it feels being a Christian right now, that you are walking one direction, but there is a predominant culture that is mocking or against Jesus' kingdom that's pulling in the opposite way. I scribbled down just a very few examples of what this feels like. We are living in a rapidly changing worldview in Canada. I don't know if you remember this or if this is part of your story, but I grew up in Ontario, not exactly the most conservative province, but I remember going to elementary school, not a Christian school, and sitting in my classroom and hearing my pastor dad's voice on the PA system, leading the school in prayer before class started. I have memories in my lifetime. Canada was never a Christian nation. It was never a Christian nation. What we had in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s was not a Christian nation, but a nation that was favorable to Christianity. Do you remember these days? What happened in that era is that even when the culture was not Christian, and it wasn't, the culture believed that Christianity had good and helpful morals that kept our communities functioning well. I don't know if you remember these days, but once upon a time, if you were a community leader or a business leader in the town, it was actually favorable to your reputation to be a leader in the church. Do you remember these days? We have moved from a time where culture found our faith maybe indifferent at best. They at least respected that we had values and morals, although they didn't want them. We have moved to a time where people are actually contrary and antagonistic to the way of Jesus. Now, part of the tension of this sermon is that this is not explicitly felt in Yarmouth like it is felt in other parts of Canada. I'll say it this way, y'all a little sheltered. In Yarmouth, we are still, as a culture and a community, neutral to slightly favorable with a sprinkling of antagonistic feelings towards the church. Did you know this? If you say you're going to church, most will shrug their shoulders. Good for you. I don't care. A very, very few number will actually push against you, and a very, very few number will applaud you. Most don't care. Does that feel about right? But in huge chunks of Canada, it is actually being propagated that they don't just want you to take your Christian faith private, they want you to dismiss it because it is damaging and harmful for humanity to flourish. So the tides are changing. The second thing I scribbled down that makes being a Jesus follower complicated is our wonderful and terrifying technology. I spoke of it last week, so I'll keep it brief, but by and large, I will tell you, technology is not overtly evil. If it was, nobody should touch it. Technology is like fire. Technology like fire can be helpful or damaging depending who's holding it. And for a lot of people, technological damage is far outweighing the technological benefits. For example, there's a level of awareness of the things in this world that you are not able to handle knowing. I've said this before, I'll say it again. Finite creatures like you and I do not possess the capacity to know an infinite amount of knowledge. Did you know this? Have you noticed, and maybe you haven't, as goes the smartphone in sales up, so goes anxiety and depression up. This is not a coincidence. This is causality. This is directly connected, and it is no longer a mystery or debated. At the rate these tools are being put into the hands of people who cannot handle them, and I mean some of you adults, some of you adults should punt your iPhone into the ocean. You can't handle it any more than my 7-year-old can. Get rid of it. However, the other issue is there is a lack of discernment of information that is flooding your way. One of the biggest issues right now is that we have a culture in the West of information skimmers. We have lost expertise, and now everybody knows everything about everything. Can I go one step further? And they're too ignorant to admit it. Sorry. What happens is, because you can scroll infinite information, you assume because I scrolled it, it is accurate and reliable. We need to possess, as Christians, a helpful filter and discernment process to reject the garbage and receive the good stuff. Yes? So from now on, you're all going to do that on Facebook, right? I'm talking to the middle-aged people predominantly right now. Oh, you got quiet on that one. Yes. There is a flood of stuff. I'll go one step further. Many people in the world, I won't say Yarmouth, many people in my network send me information that I must read as a pastor, and I must do something about it. The problem is they're sending me information that's not relevant to the country that I live in. Stop forwarding me American news. I pastor in Canada. This is the land that I live in. This is the land that I'm serving. And specifically, I pastor in Nova Scotia and not other provinces. Can I get an amen? That was cathartic. The problem is, just because you read it, don't consume it. Have a filter. Be discerning. And I'll tell you honestly, it's not just the wealth of knowledge and the access to information. What that device does is exposes people to an infinite amount of damaging content. Kids in the room, you know what I'm talking about. Be careful. People taking their phones to bed at night is like literally taking a stick with cloth wrapped around it, doused in kerosene, lit on fire, and then lay down in your bed. And you wonder why nothing good comes from scrolling at 10 to 11 p.m. Should I start preaching yet, church? This is a wonderful time to live in with access to all kinds of wonderful technology. But if we're not careful, it is burning lives to the ground. Be careful. This is a current that is going fast and hard, the opposite way of Jesus. And thirdly, if you don't think I'm worked up enough yet, this is the intro of the sermon. The third concern to the church is sexual ethics and identity politics. We are living in a time where there's a great dichotomy between the need for the church to step in and speak a humble, gracious, loving word and not being afraid to get shot for it. You feel the fear, don't you? You know the tensions. You saw famous author take a stand and get scorched. You saw actor, actress, you saw athlete, you saw business person take a stand and speak and just even present the possibility that there might be differing opinions, and you watched the outrage take them off the map, and you're like, I'm not saying anything. You knew a coworker who just accidentally said the wrong thing and was fired a week later. And it's got into your head that I'm not saying anything. Correct? It's terrifying. It's terrifying to have an opinion. It's terrifying to have a conviction. And my fear for you is that with the onslaught of opinions and nuclear charged debate, you're going to get angsty towards it. And what's going to happen if you're not careful, you're going to get angsty towards the debate and accidentally stop loving the people who need you to love it in that situation. Church, the problem is not people who are gender confused or exploring gender issues. The issue is not the people. The issue is the political charge around the people. And if we're not careful, we will damage people who are trying to figure out who God made them, why He made them this way, and why it feels so confusing. And if the church isn't careful, we're going to be so fed up with the agenda and the politics, we're going to ding somebody who needed grace and love. The second problem, and I just need you to know this, there's a whole bunch of people leveraging this ideology for personal gain, and it's muddying the water for the person who actually needs to be seen and known. Church, we need incredible wisdom right now, yes? How? How do we do what Matt Chandler said? How do we live with holiness and endurance and love and grace? Because what Yarmouth does not need is a bunch of Christians walking around arrogantly picketing the neighborhood. They don't need you showing up at work and giving your 95 thesis of why you're right and why they're damned to hell. They need to experience people who are dripping in the love of Jesus. They need people who are full of grace and full of truth and know how to discern the times and the moments they live in. Yes? Can I share a sermon now with you? Let's start preaching. Revelation chapter 4 is the antidote. Revelation chapter 4 is what turns this whole conversation upside down. If you were listening when Courtney read, it should have sounded a little bit familiar. And then I heard this voice like a trumpet. This first voice like a trumpet told me to turn and look. Now, if you've been journeying with us, chapters 2 and 3 had Jesus talking to John and asking him to write 7 letters to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. Does that ring a bell? Ephesus and Pergamum and Thyatira, and Jesus is dictating. And so John just writes out, not C+ sermons like me. John is writing out sermons straight from Jesus, and then he was to send them around to the churches. But this is not the voice of Jesus speaking. He says, I heard the first voice like a trumpet. And in chapter 1, while John is sitting on the island of Patmos on the Sabbath, caught up in the Spirit, if you read chapter 1, it says, I heard a voice like a trumpet. And here that voice comes again. The angel tells him to turn and to look. And the vision this time is not going to be on Patmos. In chapter 1, he had this incredible, privileged opportunity to turn around, to hear the voice, and to get this image of Jesus standing on Patmos in the midst of the vision of the 7 churches. And John's sitting there is like, how do I describe the indescribable? How do I write down what I'm seeing right now? How do I find language to write out, I am looking here, and all I can say is like, man, his eyes were like fire. His feet were like bronze, and his hair, and I don't know how to describe to you, so I'm going to use artistic imagination, grabbing from images and things that people have seen through the Old Testament, because I don't know how to describe this to you. And then the church for the next 2,000 years argued about the imagery. For the next 2,000 years, people were like, this means this, and this means this, and I'm against you if you see it differently. And John's like, I wasn't trying to write a doctoral thesis. I was trying to stir your imagination. Like a kid hearing the Chronicles of Narnia read for the first time. And the kid hearing maybe their parent read Narnia, and reading with that little kid walking through the wardrobe and hearing the door open in the wardrobe, and the kid's imagination is like, what did he see next? And John's like, that's what I'm trying to do. I don't know how to describe the indescribable, so let me try. And he says things like, there was jasper and carnelian stones and a rainbow with an emerald appearance, and 24 thrones and 24 elders dressed with white crowns. And there was thunder and lightning coming from the throne. There was a sea calm like crystal. There were 4 creatures with eyes all over them and 6 wings. If you want to have some fun this afternoon, get your kid or grandkid to draw this picture for you. How do you draw a creature flying around covered in eyes and 6 wings coming out everywhere? What are these stones doing? And people have wrestled and wrestled over the imagery. And what I fear, church, is that when people get frustrated about not knowing what the imagery means, they put the book away, missing the message behind the imagery. Now, church, I'm not implying there's not some meaning here. I read more pages than I can count this week trying to help figure out what these images might mean. And with all the wisdom I possess, you should not have laughed that hard. Boy, nothing like a little encouragement for your dear old pastor. You can find things. You absolutely can read brilliant scholars that I am in awe of take their best crack, cross-referencing the Old Testament and saying, these stones, these specific stones of specific colors are to represent different attributes of God. And other scholars sit down and say, no, it's not about the specific colors. It's what the light does coming through these stones of specific colors. It's like the throne is surrounded with this radiant, unapproachable light. And there's this majestic God sitting there, and there's this rainbow that's all around him. And the rainbow kind of flashes you back to the covenant that God made with Noah. saying this world is wicked, it's vile, but I'm going to birth a people. And this rainbow is going to be a sign to you that you will always remember that I will have mercy towards the people who deserve it and the people who don't. And I have to wonder if in that moment John is standing there realizing he ought not to be this close to a holy God. Now, I think he's on Patmos still. I think he's in an apocalyptic vision in heaven. The door opens and he peers in. But I wonder if he needed to see this rainbow-esque around God, reminding of the mercy that God had for people like John who do not belong near him or in his presence. People who don't add up or measure up. People like you and people like me who do not belong to come near God. There's this reminder of the covenant of God's love for broken people. There's these 24 thrones and 24 elders, and this one's quite a rabbit hole you can go down. There are people who say these are the 24 priests from the Old Testament. There are people who make a brilliant claim and case that these are the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles, the 2 making the 24, kind of bringing together the Old Testament covenant and the New Testament covenant in the presence of God, that's his people group. There's others who make great cases that these are 24 angelic beings that have gathered around saying all of these order is gathered around to worship. What's not debated is how they're dressed and what they adorn. You need to picture them standing there in pure white. You know what white's for, right? You know what black's for? Well, you know what white's for. What if it's true that the one who began a good work in you will bring it to completion one day? What if you do get to stand in the throne room dressed in white, knowing my resume does not deserve this, but Jesus dressed me in white, and he put on me a crown that is fitting a son or daughter of the king? The person around there is like in this royal purity standing around the throne, and you have people looking at the thunder and the lightning. This power and might that is coming off of the throne, coming from the throne. Now, I like living in Yarmouth most days, but you guys got gypped on one thing. I was raised in Ontario. And do you know what we have in Ontario that you guys don't have? Real thunder and lightning. You guys have wind. I'll give you the gold medal for wind. But you guys do not have a good Ontario, or I'd probably even say out the west, the prairies, when you're standing on a sunny day and black rolls up. The first wedding I ever did was in the backwoods of New Brunswick, and we're standing on the farm, sunny day, and the black started to roll up over the farm. And I'm this little 22-year-old kid, and the guy turns to me and goes, "Make it fast." 7 minutes. I told him, you pay me to do this, not how long it takes me to do it. 7 minutes. I flew through that wedding and the blackness rolled over, and then we don't get that on the coast. Not the same. There's something about standing there when thunder and lightning really cuts loose. You can feel the house shake. What does it mean that that kind of power emits from the throne? What does it mean that the throne generates that kind of might and power? Then the thing that's really fascinating are the four creatures that reflect the reality of the created order gathered around the throne. And the animals you can see represent the strong and the noble and the swift and the wise. Worry less about the individual animals and the created order gathered around the throne. Which reminds us of the main point of this whole passage. Gathered around the throne. It's fascinating to me that in all the times we've had some Revelation conversations the last few months, ever since I started saying we were going to preach about Revelation, I get so many questions about the eyes and the wings and the beast and 666 and Armageddon, all these kinds of things. And you read a chapter like chapter 4, and doesn't the imagery jump off the page to you? Doesn't it? No, it doesn't, I guess. Maybe it should. Like, you read that, like, man, the image is almost like a visual assault to the eyes. And you all of a sudden realize that's not the point. Behind all the imagery was a key word that you heard over and over and over again. And the word was throne. In the 11 verses that Courtney read, 13 times the word throne was mentioned. 13 times throne was spoken of. 40 times in the book of Revelation, the throne will be spoken of. And yet nobody has asked me about the throne. But I get questions about the beast, the timelines, the eyes, the wings, and the point is what they're all looking at. What does it mean for John to try to describe indescribable imagery that isn't the point? All the images, all the jaw-dropping spectacle is all pointed down to the throne, which is a direct shot at Caesar's throne. This is the throne at the center of heaven that all other earthly thrones bend a knee to. All the things that John saw in that thing was the throne dead center. And the most beautiful thing he said about the throne, don't miss it, there was one seated on the throne. What's the purpose of a throne that's vacant? What's the purpose with a throne without a ruler? And John looks through all the noise going on and says there is one seated on the throne. And for the guy who hasn't lacked imagery, to the guy who wrote Revelation with over 500 Old Testament references or allusions, here's how he describes the one seated on the throne. Where did his artistry go? Where did the imagination go? Where did all the colorful things go? He just says, there's one seated on the throne. And if there's one seated on the throne, everything else comes into alignment. Where's John right now? On Patmos. His world is chaotic. The rulers of the day are anti-Christian at the highest level. I have yet to be imprisoned. I'm not saying it won't happen, it just hasn't happened. I have yet to actually be persecuted. I have been inconvenienced, we'll say. John is being persecuted, disciples are being killed, Christians are being imprisoned and killed, and John looks up and all that he has to say is there is one seated on the throne. And if there's one seated on the throne, everything else comes into alignment. While commentators don't agree on what everything means, they all agree on why the story is here. Jesus is about to show John some wild things of bowls and scrolls and trumpets and beasts and battles and judgment and destruction and creation and recreation. And the life he thinks is chaotic and the currents he feels going against him aren't going to be anything compared to what he sees in a moment. And what he's about to see in a moment will absolutely crush him if he's not clear for who is seated on the throne and holds all the things that are to come in the palm of his hand. Church, I don't know what you face as you walk out holiness and endurance in the time in which we live. I honor the trials and the tribulations you find yourself in, but may I just say, they pale in comparison to the one seated on the throne. Church, I don't know the things that are coming in the days ahead of you that may feel like chaos is increased, but may I just say, it pales in comparison to the image of the one who is seated on the throne. Church, I don't know whether Christianity will ever find favor in our country. I don't know if the battles get worse. I don't know if the opposition gets more intense. I don't know if we lose our charitable status one day. I don't know if I'm imprisoned or what's going to happen, and neither do you. The point what Jesus is showing John and John wants us to see is it all bends a knee to the one seated on the throne. Thank you, guy in the corner saying amen. You have two choices. You can leave here consumed and obsessed with the current coming at you. You can leave here stressing and fearful about the current that's trying to push and sweep against you. Or you can ask the Spirit to give you a fresh vision of the one seated on the throne. Church, I have to ask you, what might happen if you, for yourself, caught a fresh glimpse of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords seated on the throne in the heavenly places? What might happen if the economy of church changed, where you didn't learn things about God from me, I got to affirm things Jesus was saying to you? What might happen if your primary place of feeding was not with me, but actually in the throne room of heaven with Jesus himself, where he speaks to you and cuts out the middleman? What might happen to how you walk out your life if you saw Jesus fresh and new today? There's a part of this story that is my favorite, and I think you'll know why in a second. There's a kind of a chain reaction that happens in heaven that I think needs to happen in this room. At chapter 4, in verse 8, it says, "And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and within. And day and night they cease to say," now pause. Pause here and pause at Coastal. What time did your alarm go off this morning? Whatever time you got up, I'll guarantee you what was happening before you got up. In the heavenly places, people were around the throne worshiping God. Before you got up, worship was already happening at an intense level in the throne room of heaven. Coastal, before you gathered, worship was already happening. We don't start worship, we join it. And the 4 creatures flew around, never ceasing, saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come." And I love this part. "And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks," when do they do it? Well, come on now. Always. Wake up, church. Always. Always. Here's the response. When they do the thing they always do, the one who lives forever, the 24 elders fall down before him, who is seated on the throne, and worship him who lives forever and ever. And I love this part. "And they cast down their crowns." Whatever the value of the golden crown, it pales in comparison to offering it in worship, saying, "Worthy are you, O Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created." Church, what if there was a kinetic reaction that when we gathered, the minute we knew there was worship in heaven happening, it caused a worship reaction in this room and out to Coastal? What if what happened when you caught a glimpse of Jesus, you could not help but worship? contrary to the culture and contrary to the people sitting around you who might think you're weird? What if you could not help worshiping, not because it was appropriate, but because he was worth worshiping?